Good morning. This is Richard Edelman from New York. This morning, we'll be doing a discussion of the U.S. election, and I'm going to start out with some slides from the Trust Barometer. You'll recall from prior meetings that there are 3 or 4 important trends. The first trend is that more or less cross institutions, Republicans generally have a lower trust level than Democrats. It's particularly so of government and of media, 23 and 29 points respectively. The only institution Republicans rate higher than Democrats is business, 60% nearly for Republicans, 55 for Democrats. Importantly, we find that after elections, trust in government declines. And it declines because the losing party loses belief in the institution of government. So, for example, the delta between Republicans and Democrats moved after the U.S. 2020 election from 2 points to 24 points on trust in government. This is consistent with prior findings. After Obama was elected, -6, after Trump was elected, -14, after Biden was elected, -3, but it was always the losing party that had substantial declines in trust. As you'll see again, Republicans -20, 1-year change after the prior election. Very important, there is massive difference in attitudes towards institutions between the top quartile and the bottom quartile of income. I just want you to see that the biggest difference is for business, 24 points, but it's also substantial for NGOs, media, and government. Further, it's clear that associates in the workplace are far less trusting of institutions than executives. Again, you can see -32 for business, -32 for NGOs, -32 for government, -32 for media. More or less, even in the workplace, there is a massive trust gap between the high level and the bottom level. Also, across minority communities, we saw a substantial drop just in the last year for trust in government and trust in media, particularly so with Latinos. Take a look, a -10 for government, a -9 for media. Again, it's not that business is immune from all this, but business tends to run higher for those groups. Also, critically important, Gen Z doesn't trust the system. It doesn't trust what's happened in elections. And we've had 50 plus this year. Only 47% of Gen Z trust the electoral system and agree that my government was fairly and legitimately elected. A stunning finding. So now Kirsty Graham, who runs our U.S. business, will introduce the panel, and I'll join the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you everyone for being here today. I'm delighted to be joined by our panel. We have Nikki Haley, who is former US ambassador to the UN and governor of South Carolina, who is joining us from London. Thank you, Nikki. We have Max Baucus, former US senator and ambassador to China. Thank you for joining us. Senator Baucus, I know you're in Hong Kong, where it is 11 p.m. So a special thank you to you, and to Andrew Edgecliffe-Johnson, who is the US news editor of the Financial Times. Andrew, thank you for being here today. So we had a dramatic week last week. We saw the US have its biggest shift to the right in decades. We saw Trump winning all 7 swing states and making inroads across a number of demographics. And we've seen the pace continue right since last week. Overnight, we saw a slew of cabinet appointments. Today, we know there is the Senate leadership vote. And there is also, at the end of this call, I believe, the meeting between President Biden and President Trump in the White House. So we want this call to be very practically focused on how does business think about the Trump administration and keep pace with the developments that we know are coming. To that end, we would love to take your questions, and we have a chat set up already. So please put in questions as we go. I did say I wanted this to be forward-looking, but I do have one question that I'd like to begin with, and I'll start with you, Andrew. Much has been made of the role of traditional media, the reach and role of traditional media versus what we saw happening in the podcast creator influencer space. Can you give us some observations of where media sits and how we should look at this election going forward, given what's happened?
Absolutely. And first of all, thanks very much for having me, Kirsty. I think we could all drive ourselves crazy after this election looking for the one neat explanation for anything. And I think that's very much true of the media ecosystem as well. A former colleague of mine, Wolfgang Munchau, described the traditional media as the Norma Desmond of media, with sort of delusions about its remaining influence today. I don't think it's quite that bad, but what I think we are seeing is a massive fragmentation of media behavior. We've been watching it for a very long time now. This has put a new light on the extent of that fragmentation. I just want to give you a couple of data points which I think might help inform this. If you read a newspaper, you are 3.5 times more likely to have voted for Kamala Harris than Donald Trump. 18 to 29-year-olds are now almost 5 times as likely to get their news primarily from social media as from television. And about 26 million people watched Kamala Harris's speech to the DNC. Nearly 8 million watched her on Fox News, but 48 million people watched Joe Rogan's interview with with Donald Trump on YouTube alone, and that is not counting the audio audience for that podcast. So we are seeing a new rise, a new sort of conservative media ecosystem. We can't just think of it as it's Fox News or it's Breitbart or it's whatever the one sort of leading brand is. It is a huge ecosystem, starting with Elon Musk and his platform. He has 200 million followers personally. He controls that algorithm, and he's actively pushing the idea that legacy media is propaganda. Second, the sort of ecosystem that Don Jr. and Barron Trump leaned into, the manosphere, contrarian personalities like Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson, platforms like Twitch, Reddit, boxers like Jake and Logan Paul, Aiden Ross, the video game streamer. So podcasts are a big part of it, but actually the audience for those podcasts is often bigger on YouTube. And just finally, we need to think very differently about which influencers have influence. You might have thought that Taylor Swift and Charlie XCX and Megan Thee Stallion were going to tip things for Kamala Harris, but it turns out that Kai Trump, RFK Jr., Danica Patrick, Hulk Hogan, and others were ultimately more persuasive.
That is fascinating, Andrew, and thank you for those data points. Richard, you and I have talked about this. Any observations that you make on the same question?
I think that the idea that you can, in a way, put up controlled, small, short segments on TikTok and persuade is now bust. That you're much better off if you're a brand or a corporation and you want to make your case. Sit down with Joe Rogan. Sit down and have a discussion. Come out, even if you're not going to be perfect in your messaging, you are, in a way, doing the ordeal of media, because, Bryson DeChambeau is media, as is Aiden Ross. And, they have a sort of equal level of weight for younger generation. So again, the short form 3-minute doesn't work as well as the long form. And it's a different game. If you're a corporation, you've got to consider this. I love the FT. God knows, read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, et cetera. But it's that and. It's not or, it's and.
I think that point around not or and is a really important one. And I think for anyone leading an organization, thinking about where you show up is an obvious takeaway from this. I want to go to both Nikki and Max now and ask you both. Much has been talked about the business environment, right? So we have talks about, will this be a better environment for M&A? What will happen with corporate tax? But I know the one that is top of mind for many is the issue of trade policy and tariffs. Nikki, can I begin with you and say, what can we expect here? Will we see transactional arrangements? Will it be blanket? What's your sense of what's going to happen in trade policy?
Well, I think from a business perspective, you should look at the fact that the next few years are going to be a growth period. It's a good time to invest in the U.S. Yes, M&A will start to see that start to increase as well. And you're going to see a lot of regulations dropped, especially we're going to see in the EPA and the DOT. You're going to see a lot of regulations that are reduced, and some streamlining that comes into play. When it comes to tariffs, I think you can look that it's expected Lighthizer will be kind of a trade czar. He is pro-tariff. I think the way the administration is lining up its tariffs, but I think, you have to remember what's said in a campaign doesn't always come to fruition when you're governing. So while I do think there will be tariffs, and I know that Donald Trump is pro-tariff, I think that it will be somewhat focused on certain priorities. I think he's going to focus in early on automobiles, especially with the focus of making sure Chinese cars don't come in through the Mexican border. I think he's going to be focused on steel. We saw that he put tariffs on steel and aluminum before. Biden came in and took those tariffs off. I think that anything related to China should very much, from a business perspective, you should start looking at a plan B, and assume that, yes, very much there could be tariffs on supplies within your manufacturing, but also the product itself. And keep in mind that Donald Trump doesn't look at manufacturing in a way that sometimes we think. So, for example, South Carolina builds more BMWs than any place in the world. But Donald Trump sees that as assembly, not manufacturing, because there are no parts made in the US. So he will focus in on manufacturing. I know the South Korean trade minister recently just said that he expects South Korean companies to start investing in the US. I think you're going to see globally more companies looking to, now is the time to invest in the US to avoid any of the tariff situation. And I think that any companies thinking about moving to Mexico, moving somewhere else, would want to take caution, because I think that that would put kind of a dartboard on you for going forward. I also think that we're going to see a reduction in the corporate taxes as we go forward, because I think that the tax policies that Trump put in place in 2017, they're up for extension. And I think he's going to further reduce the corporate taxes. So I think that's going to kind of weigh in as well. And then you see that he is now doing his government efficiency kind of, it's not an agency, but I call it just kind of a committee. And I think they're going to look for ways to see where they can pull out. So I think a lot of things going to be happening over the next 4 years, but I think it's a good time for businesses to think creatively and to lean into it and not be reactionary, and start looking at what their plan Bs are in terms of if they're doing any business primarily in Mexico, primarily in Canada, they'll want to be cautious of that.
So thank you for that, Nikki. Lots to unpack in there. And I think that point around assembly versus manufacturing is a really interesting one. Max, can I ask you, especially having, sat and been ambassador in China, when you think of supply chains, think of diversity, comments from your perspective on what business should be thinking about?
Well, President-elect Trump's done a pretty good job signaling what he wants to do. Clearly, Trump loves tariffs. Certainly did when he's previously president, under Section 301. And as Nikki said, there's a provision called 232. That's where he decided that there should be no more, where we cut steel, aluminum, and other imports come to the United States. So he's signaling what he wants to do. I think it's important to remember, though, that there's a couple of things here. There's tariffs and taxation is very, very linked together. There are a couple of reasons why Trump likes tariffs. One is he likes to punish other countries, basically more jobs in the United States. He feels that significant tariffs, he's talked about a 60% tariff, for example, on Chinese imports coming to the United States, and about 10 to 20% across the board. So one is jobs in the United States. But the other reason he likes tariffs is revenue. He thinks that the high tariffs will raise a lot of revenue. And why does he want to do that? Because he wants to use that revenue, he thinks, will come from the tariffs to extend the tax cuts when he was president. Now, that's about a $1.3 trillion increase in revenue, or excuse me, $1.3 trillion addition to the debt if the taxes are not extended. And I think he wants to use a tariff revenue to make up the difference to allow some of those reductions. The corporate taxes will be reduced, as will individual, high-end individual. That's what he likes to do. But, you know, I was once chairman of the finance committee. Taxation is like making sausage. I mean, there are trade-offs back and forth and back and forth. A lot of it has to do with the senators or the House members' districts. You know, what company is in that district or in that state makes a big difference. There are going to be trade-offs there. But Trump, on the other hand, very much, as he said, wants to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't think he'll be able to repeal it, but he will cut back significantly. That, of course, means there'll probably be less incentives for renewables, more incentives for traditional energy production. That's clear, but the Congress will deal with that. Now, there is a filibuster still available in the Congress. Democrats might try to filibuster. On the other hand, the Republican majority can find a way with the rules to basically allow legislation to go through it with just a majority vote. You don't need, 60 votes. So and I do think too that there was some imports from China. As Nikki indicated, they'll be targeted more than others. Clearly, EVs, that's a big one. Could be batteries, other technology which is perceived to be important for our national expansion. But by and large, there will be tariff reductions, tariff increases, and it's going to be it won't be as clear as I think as it looks at this point. He's just starting out. I mean, he's saying a lot, doing a lot of stuff, but he is president. He will have majority in the Senate, probable majority in the House. He wants to recess appointments. You probably get some of that. So he's on a roll. But after a while, we'll see the degree to which all that really pans out.
So Max, that was great. And what I should say to everyone is that questions are coming in fast. So there's a follow-up one for Andrew and Richard, which I'll come back to. But just on the tariff piece, two pieces that come in. One related to observations you might make about the labor market, where immigration and availability of workers fits in with this. And then a very specific one around the impact of tariffs to Canada, given that the Canadian and US auto market in particular is so integrated. Can I go to you, Nikki, and then, yeah, Max?
Yeah,
Okay,
so
well, go ahead,
please.
Nikki.
No, Max, go ahead, please.
No, ladies first. Go ahead.
Well, I think that USMCA, when Trump negotiated that last time, he put in a special clause that it would be under review in 2026, I believe. So he is going to call for that to come back under review. That's when I think they'll look at what the situation is, and he's going to look at, is it a fair deal, or does he feel it's imbalanced? And I think right now, he's going to look at that, weigh that. I think a lot of the reason why he's going to be going in kind of hard towards Mexico, like I said, is really not so much that he has it out for Mexico, but keep in mind, he wants to go back to the Remain in Mexico policy. He needs Mexico for that. He wants to cut back on fentanyl. He's going to need Mexico for that. In terms of any of the immigration, he'll need Mexico. So a lot of times when he talks about tariffs, it's meant for leverage. It's meant for negotiation. It doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen. You're not necessarily going to see 60% on China. You're not going to necessarily see 10 or 20% on the board. That is Trump's way of kind of putting everyone on notice to see what is going to happen there. I think with the labor market, you look just, since we're on kind of on that theme of the auto industry, the auto industry lost 30,000 jobs in the US since June. And so the goal is, the reason he's wanting to get manufacturing back in the US is he's wanting more investment in the US, is to really kind of go hard at those jobs and see what they could do to increase labor participation as well. On the immigration front, you can tell from the people that he has surrounded himself by, they are hardcore pro-border, pro-legal immigration. And I think what you're going to see is they're not going to do mass deportations. They're going to focus on those that have a criminal record first. And I think that's kind of what we're going to see. So you're not going to see something happen tomorrow. I think you're going to start to see the border get locked up in a way that there's not this flow. I think you're going to start to see any criminals whatsoever that are here illegally will be deported. And then I think the rest will have to see what happens.
Thank you. Max, did you want to chime in as well?
I think that's a pretty good summary. I would not want to be the new president of Mexico. I mean, Claudia Sheinbaum is going to have a real difficult time now dealing with the United States with immigration and with tariffs. It's going to be very, very difficult. But I think, as Nikki says, Trump also is very much a negotiator. There's a lot of tension here, frankly, already in the almost administration. On the one hand, there are the Rubios and the Waltzes who are very much over big hawks against China. I mean, they are very hawkish. Now, Pompeo didn't make it, so he was even more hawkish. But the point is that the people he's appointing to these top jobs are very hawkish. On the other hand, Trump himself, as we know, likes to think himself as a deal maker. So as the Rubios of the world are pushing hawkish strategies toward China, President-elect Trump's going to be thinking, well, I don't know, maybe I could do a deal with China. Maybe I could do a deal, maybe on tariffs with China. Maybe do a deal on Taiwan with China. Maybe do with Mexico. And so it's important to look at the tension between the true believers, like Rubio on the one hand, and
Yep.
Donald Trump, who believes this stuff, but also the deal maker much more than is Rubio.
So I want to go to Andrew and Richard. Richard, I'll start with you because I think you might both want to weigh in on that conversation we've just had. Can I also, when you've got the floor, can I ask you, how would you combat misinformation and propaganda? Because that was the follow-up question to the piece you both said on the role of traditional media going forward. In a world where there are less checks, how should a business be thinking? Richard, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I want to talk a bit about trade and tariffs. I think the Europeans, the Japanese, and the Koreans need to be very aggressive in making their case for bilateral trade. That America sells a lot into Europe, that European companies, Nikki was governor and attracted a whole bunch to South Carolina. They have massive interests in this country. And so the idea of putting a 10% universal tariff, for instance, on all products from Europe, that needs to be combated and pronto. And it needs to be explained why it's beneficial to have, lower prices for consumers, make the alternative case, and do it collectively as opposed to individually. On the matter of disinformation, I think that companies need to be scanning Reddit and other of what has been seen as sort of fringe, which is now arguably more mainstream, and to feel quite compelled faster to combat misinformation. And to do it not just with classic experts because they've been depositioned, but for people who have broad appeal, who have been briefed, who are more what I call sort of horizontal conveyors of trust as opposed to top down, because the top down scientists, et cetera, some communities don't believe. So it's the air game and the ground game. Edge?
I just add that I think my industry's done a very bad job of differentiating between the fact-based, reality-based media and the polarization, partisan, opinion-based media. And I've been very lucky to work for a place where we have a pretty even split of Republicans and Democrats, Conservatives and Labour voters in the UK. And the reason for that, I think, is that people read an outlet like the FT to understand the world as it is, not the world that they'd like to see. They don't want a mirror. They want to understand the full kind of messiness and complexity of what they have to deal with as policymakers, as business leaders, as investors. I think people on this call, people in the corporate world, in the financial world, have a role in speaking up for factual-based media, in helping to understand and proselytize that differentiation. For all of the rise of the new influencers, I still think the big set piece in the Financial Times, the big interview in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, whoever it may be, still drives the agenda in a way that very few individual outlets, perhaps apart from perhaps the Joe Rogan podcast, might do. I think I agree with Richard. It's very important to be scanning the Reddits of this world. I think it's more so that you understand what the alternative view is, what the kind of potential backlash is. I think a lot of companies have done a bad job of really listening to their critics, of really understanding where the heat is. And I think, what this election should tell us is if any institution doesn't listen to its critics and doesn't understand the strength of anger and feeling, there are some nasty surprises out there.
So, Andrew, I want to stay with that one, and it's actually a question for all of you. When you talk about complexity and understanding a different point of view, how do each of you recommend business or CEOs or leaders handle issues that polarize the US electorate? How do you handle those issues with your employee base? When should the CEO speak up, and on what? So I would love to hear all your views on that. So I'm going to look at you to decide who wants to go first.
Yeah, I'll start with that. I think that when you look at this election and you look at the American people speaking out, I think businesses in general can pick up a lot from that, and they should pick up a lot from that in terms of how to do business. I think that what you are seeing is the American people really want to see businesses go back to doing business. They rejected identity politics across the board. It's not because you've got, people who are phobic or racist. That's not the case. They just want to get back to being Americans. They just want to get back to where they're not being judged or talked to in a way that they are made to feel guilty. So what does that mean for a CEO? The first thing is, you should always want to take care of your people. I mean, those are the people that are making, your products. They're helping you with your bottom line. So taking care of them is important. And I think making sure that they have mentoring options, making sure that you celebrate them in whatever ways you're doing now in your company and more, you should continue to do. But when it comes to your consumers, that's the part where you draw the line. Your consumers don't want to necessarily hear what you think politically. They don't want to know what you think about social issues or political issues. They just want you to be good at your job and producing that product and focusing on your employees and making money. What happens inside, I actually think we're not seeing enough companies actually use their employees for solutions. The best way to deal with employees, they want to feel valuable. And I know in South Carolina, we didn't have unions. And they say I was a union buster, but I actually wasn't a union buster as much as I was constantly talking to CEOs about how they could handle their employee base. And it was making sure that employees were involved in the problems of the company and that they were helping find the solutions. It makes a much more dedicated employee, makes a much more loyal employee, and making sure they're given the respect and the value that they want. That goes much further than anything related to identity politics or all of that. So I think that, of course, everyone wants to be treated equally and fairly. That should happen on the inside of a company. But when you're dealing with consumers really don't want to know where CEOs and boards feel on social issues that aren't related to their product. And I think that those that, I always say, you want to work towards a Dolly Parton approach. Everybody loves Dolly Parton. No one knows what she politically thinks or believes on any issues outside of that. And that's why people like her, is because she doesn't push what she thinks on anybody else. And I think that businesses should consider going back to that approach. I think it'll make it, we need 100% of our consumers. We don't need to pick off any of them. So if you need all of them, just focus on selling the product. And on the inside with your employees, keep them in the loop on what your challenges are and ask them for help on the solutions.
So I want
Thanks,
to
Andrew.
I want to follow on Nikki's points and give a slightly different view, which is, I think there are certain issues that you have to talk to your employees about, which I think Nikki would agree with. And these are sometimes really controversial issues, choice or of the like. But then there are issues related to your business on how you source, where you make products, that you, in fact, are sourcing from sustainable sources. If you're Mars from Ghana for cocoa beans or whatever, people want to know also that you're paying your people well and that you're treating your employees well. So these are the kinds of things that CEOs 100% should talk about. That it's about the business of business, and not the business of politics. There is a way to speak to how business is done that doesn't get you into political hot water.
And I completely
so-
agree with that. I completely agree with that.
So don't be a tortoise and put your head back in the shell. It is you put your head out to eat and, like this. And when it gets crazy, you just put your head back in a little. It's a bad example, but you get the idea.
So I'm going to go to Andrew and then Max, and then lots of questions coming. Andrew.
I bet. I mean, we've been in the middle of a huge debate about the social role of business for at least the last 6-7 years. It's been this. We have this backlash to the Milton Friedman definition that all you need to do is make a profit. I think that backlash probably peaked 2020. Early 2021, that extraordinary sequence of COVID, of George Floyd, of the last change of government had passions running extremely high and put a lot of demands on employers to fill a perceived gap left by dysfunctional, divided government. A polarized government. I think we're going to see some of those demands return, even though we've seen this pressure ebbing, I think, over the last 2 to 3 years, and we've seen the kind of cost that companies like Disney and others have paid for leaning in a little too hard to that pressure. I agree with Nikki and with Richard. I think this starts at a very, very local level. I think we're going to see less virtue signaling from corporate America, and we need to see more actual virtue when it comes to the basics of paying people a fair salary, promoting people fairly based on merit, and maybe giving us a pension at the end of it all. I think that is the expectation. I think create great products that do the minimum of harm to the wider planet and community, and pay the people who make it appropriately.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Max, I'm interested in your views. And while you have the floor, I have a question that's come through actually, but a couple of these, but people want to know about relationships with the Middle East and also with the EU. What should people be thinking about from a business perspective? So I'm handing to you, Max, a few things in there.
Two prior speakers, I think, made very good points. I'd add one more. I think the CEO has to be a great role model. That is, have all the values that we want in individuals and we want in the companies: honesty, transparency, vision, hard work ethic. The CEO has to be the role model, and others, it's not do as I say, it's do as I do. If the CEO is a good role model, if he or she is practicing all the values that he or she wants for employees, then that's going to make a big, big difference. And that also has to be extended down the next 2 or 3 levels. I mean, they're top officials, they're top lieutenants. Same thing, be great role models. That's really, really important for tons of reasons. Then I, as prior speakers have said, it just make a good product, really good product. Consumers want good products. A company that I have a very high regard for is Costco. Costco pays its employees very well. Costco has great benefits. Costco turnover is much lower than in any other companies. Costco's biggest store, by the way, is in Shanghai. And you don't see the head of Costco making a lot of public statements either. My approach would be to keep your head down, be a great company, take care of your employees, listen to your employees, have them participate. But then afterwards, you set the vision, you set the tone, what this company is all about. So be a good role model, and encourage self-respect. Really encourage people to listen to each other. My political mentor is a former senator named Mike Mansfield. And I remember he said to me once, "Now, Max, remember, you're not always right, and the other guy is not always wrong." And it's mutual self-respect. It's exploring the other person's assumptions and premises. And pretty soon you're going to find out there's a lot more agreement than you think. But it's mutual self-respect. The MAGA people are just as smart and just as good as the progressives. We're Americans, but we have to listen to each other. And a good CEO will help encourage that.
Max, while I have you, some really interesting, I think some great points on leadership there. EU, Middle East, anything you want to say there? And then I'm going to come to you, Nikki, for the same question.
Well, Nikki's over at EU, so she could probably do a pretty good job on that. The real concern is the EU is having a hard time. I mean, economically, they're just falling back a little bit. There are lots of different countries, tension between the Commission and the individual countries. It's a problem. Now, China is going to do its best to take advantage of all that. The more that President Trump is America first, protectionism and so forth worldwide, including Europe. Don't forget that Section 232 tariffs when he was president were against Europeans too, and they hated it. Man, they hated it. And the same thing against the Canadians. They hated it just as much. And I don't know whether President Trump will enact 232s again like he did last time. But China is going to look at seeking an advantage. It's not just in Europe. It's in the Mideast. It's in the global South. It's in Southeast Asia. And there's going to be a vacuum in 2 or 3 little spots that China is going to identify as a consequence of excessive, if that's the case, American protectionism. And I think we should be cognizant of all that because, let's remember, China does not have a history of military aggression. They're not military aggressors. Sure, they entered Vietnam after we did. Sure, Korea after we did. We're aggressors. Afghanistan, Central America, Iraq, and so forth. But China is a country of economic aggression, and that's what they're doing with Belt and Road Initiative, with AI, with all the things they're doing. It's getting economic advantage in different parts of the globe, and they're going to try to find a way to pick off some of those South countries if the United States gets too protectionistic.
Okay, Nikki, Andrew, anything you want to add on either Europe or Middle East? Then I've got one more question. Andrew, do you want to go?
I just had one thing. I think last time we all remember that picture of Donald Trump kind of looming over the table of other G7 leaders, I think it was, or G8, with Angela Merkel sort of sitting there rather stolidly. There's no Merkel this time. And I think don't expect a unified response in Europe. There is a significant populist movement and several very important populist leaders in Europe who may have more affinity with Donald Trump than they do with traditional values of the EU. I think there's genuine concern among investors that Europe could suffer a sort of double hit of US imposed tariffs and China flooding the region with the sort of cheap imports that it can't get so easily into the US. I think we need to watch that. There'll be an interesting test case of quite how Europe deals with the tariff threat in the US coming up quite soon. The EU has to decide whether to renew the retaliatory tariffs that they took on US goods from Bourbon to Harley Davidson's, I think, by March. So that'll give us an early indicator of quite how unified the continent is looking. But it's I wouldn't expect it to be quite as unified this time.
Well,
Okay.
and Kirsty, I'll tell you, in terms of the EU, there's some real opportunities there. The first thing I'll say is the EU, in their statements, they have started to normalize, which I think is a good sign. They're not saying, that climate is the number one issue. They are now focusing on the economy. That's a good thing. I think there's an opportunity for the US and the EU to together focus on the economy. And, there's also an opportunity. You look at the Europeans are still getting 16, 20% of their LNG from Russia. Instead, if they decided to get that from the US, that's a great opportunity there. And what I think, it would be good is I hope the EU leans into this and starts to want to proactively negotiate with Trump so that there's not, a push. I think the 2 countries that Trump is going to be somewhat have his backup on is Germany, still because he remembers the Merkel moment, but I think he also blames them. I was at the UN when they talked about the Nord Stream 2 and the fact that Russia was able to control so much. The other one is France. He and Macron have always had somewhat of a rub in terms of a relationship. So I think those are the 2 countries that are going to have to kind of work a little harder. The rest, I think it is an open opportunity. And what I'm doing here in Europe is talking to CEOs about how do you lean into that? How do you make sure that you're on the front end and not, on the floor when that happens? And I think that can happen. In terms of the Middle East, again, opportunities. You've got all very strong pro-Israel appointees that he's put in there. I think he's going to go in and want to settle that very quickly in terms of what happens with Israel and the fractions with the factions they have with Iran's terrorist organizations. And I think that opens up Saudi Arabia, that opens up UAE, that opens up business to happen there. And I think those countries are waiting to do it. And so, if that happens sooner rather than later, which I expect it will, I think that you can look at open markets again in that area.
So I can't tell you how many questions that are coming in. I mean, we could go for such a long time. It's been a fascinating conversation. Before I hand it to you, Richard, to close out, I want to ask Andrew, Nikki, and Max one or two very practical things that you think business should do and be prepared for as we see what's coming in the pace of change. Andrew, I'm going to go to you first.
Right. Three things. One is remember the art of the deal. A lot of this is negotiation, as other speakers have said. This is going to be a very transactional period. Two, companies still have power. Your employees will be and your consumers will be looking to you in some extent to still stand up for what is genuinely important to you. You know, this isn't this, you don't have to roll over on everything. And I think finally, as Richard's slides showed, this election was in part a rebellion against the elites of media, of establishment politics, and of big business on both sides of the aisle. Don't look like the elites. You need, if you're a CEO, you need to be in touch with what the shop floor is thinking. You need to be listening to your workforce, your customers. You need to be listening to your critics, and you need to keep your scenario planning very broad.
Thank you, Andrew. Max.
Yes. Obviously, this is a time of great disruption. Trump is a disruptor. Now, there's sometimes there are golden linings with disruption, but disruption means change, means unpredictable change. So CEOs clearly have to spend a lot of time trying to figure all that out. What's going on and in what direction are you going? It also means to me staying very engaged, leaning in, hiring the best lobbyists, finding people who can help make your case. Because let's say tariffs. Trump's going to enact tariffs. He's got the authority to do so. It doesn't need Congress to do it. Now, you might want to get an exemption from a tariff. If you got access to Trump's administration, maybe through a lobbyist, maybe through somebody else, you might get an exemption. And probably Musk is going to get an exemption on Teslas. So you've got to be involved and look for ways to help your company and get access to this administration. In addition to all that, I can support, understand social media. Frankly, I'm a big FT reader, Wall Street Journal, et cetera, as we all are. But I wouldn't get too wrapped up with all the noise. I mean, sure, know what's going on, but the main thing is, I think, the company needs to stick to its knitting, do what it can do what it does, and do it very, very well, and make great product, and know what's going on. But just don't get too distracted because there are going to be a lot of changes. I think what we see today is not going to be what we see maybe a year from now.
Thank you very much, Max. Nikki, before I hand it to Richard.
Yes, first of all, see the opportunities that are out there. I think that this is a time for businesses to do what they do best, which is you get flexible and you lean into a situation. Go back to just focusing on business and doing good business. Take care of your employees. Let them know that they are valued. Make sure you have a plan B. If you're doing any supplies, any sort of part of your supply chain is related to China, is related to Mexico, or any of these hot button issues, go ahead and get in front and come up with your plan B in case you need that. And finally, just know we're there, whether it is to speak to your CEO, whether it's to speak to your boards, to talk to you about how to maneuver this time. Edelman wants to be your best friend. Let us be that best friend for you and help you get through the process.
Thank you all for the time today. A fascinating conversation. Richard, over to you to close us out.
So it's the 25th anniversary of the Trust Barometer, and over these 25 years, we've had 4 important findings. The first is that business has risen to be the most trusted institution in the world, ahead of government, NGOs, and media. And that's placed enormous responsibility on business on issues historically that business hasn't had to lead on. And it's because business is seen as more competent as well as more ethical. The second is the mass class divide, which I tried to demonstrate in the beginning, the bottom quartile versus the top quartile, attitudes towards institutions. And you saw that particularly so in some of the ethnic groups, Hispanics, et cetera, with massive losses of confidence. The third is the battle for truth, misinformation, the idea of first thought bubbles, but now a complete checking out of mainstream media by certain age groups, for example. And the extent to which things are sort of infotainment, or however you want to describe it, the sort of nexus between Bryson DeChambeau and, becoming a leading, podcaster. He's a golfer, but now he's also an important voice. The fourth is the rise of fears. And you saw that with job loss. You see this with AI in the US, 5-1 against. The last is on nationalism, the idea somehow that our country is getting robbed one way or another. So the trust barometer for 25 is going to focus on two really important areas. The first is, what is the importance of optimism as a third element in, if competence is the x-axis, if the y-axis is ethical behavior, is there a z-axis of optimism? Do I believe that I'm going to be better off in 5 years? And which institution is going to help get me there? The second is really, how do we get truth to people? How do we get facts in front of people with a dispersed information system? So those are our areas of inquiry, and I will really look forward to speaking with you in mid-January when we have the data. And so thank you all for joining. I'm so thrilled to have Nikki and Max at the firm. Edge, I'm wishing you all the best in your new venture at Semaphore. Kirsty, well done. Thank you all.